Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. In particular, I'm going to be talking about how industrialization, which occurs in the United States during the second half of the 1800s, so from about 1850 to about 1900, the way in which it leads to the development of our current economic system, which is industrial capitalism. And industrial capitalism, if we're going to define it, is just an economic and social system in which resources like industry, capital, labor are privately controlled, meaning people can own them, right? You can start your own business, you can purchase a plot of land, you can build a factory, and then you can use that factory to make profit for yourself. This is industrial capitalism in a nutshell, and this becomes the dominant economic system in the United States and most developed countries during the second half of the 1800s. So why does this happen? Well, this happens for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the American population grows massively during this time period. In 1860, there were 31 million people living here. By 1920, there was about 106 million. So what we're looking at is 60 years, the population almost quadrupling. A big part of this was immigration, and a big part of the reason so many people are immigrating here is because the American government is actively supporting economic growth. They're setting aside land for people that want to settle in the West. They're basically granting it to them, basically giving it away for free. Um, and we also see massive economic growth during this period. Economic output grows by 500% between 1860 and 1920. We were the fourth in industrial production in 1860. By 1900, we are the largest industrial producer in the world, and we're making 35% of all industrial goods. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, this means that we're making now more than the three countries that were previously ahead of us combined. And all of this is really made possible by a revolution in agriculture that's happening during the first half of the 19th century. We start to see technological advances like the steam-powered plow that makes agricultural production more efficient. But also farmers themselves are starting to take a more scientific approach to growing crops. They're experimenting with more productive, more disease-resistant strains of those crops. And as a result, by 1900, we see that one farmer can feed 99 other people. This was not the case before. And in fact, if you lived in the United States in 1800, odds were that you were a subsistence farmer, meaning you grew enough food to feed your family, maybe had a little bit left over to sell at market, and you would use that money to buy supplies to grow food for the next year. But basically, you were living year to year and you were growing food for yourself. And that was what American life was like in 1800. But because one farmer can now feed 99 other people by 1900, this means that the majority of American people no longer have to be farmers. They don't need to work in agriculture. This means that labor is freed up to work in industrial production. And we see also, because food becomes more abundant, because one farmer can grow so much more food, that food prices drop as well. So people start to have more money to purchase industrial goods. They're not spending all of their money purchasing food. And another thing that facilitates the growth of industrial capitalism during this time period, the Industrial Revolution, is the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad is simply the idea that there is a railroad that goes across the continent of North America. In 1865, there was only about 35,000 miles of railroad track in the United States, but by 1900, there's 193,000, and the East Coast is connected to the West Coast by railroad track for the first time. This meant that as an individual, you could travel across the entire country in a 9-day train ride, which was never possible before, which means you are more connected to the rest of the country in ways than you never were before. But also, more importantly, it opens up distant markets. If you are a business owner and you're operating in Chicago and you want to sell to people in California, this was virtually impossible before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. You could not transfer your goods that far. So you were limited in how big your business could grow. So business gets to expand to a national scale for the first time as a result of this. Also, as the railroad is trying to build the Transcontinental Railroad itself, they're engaging in some kind of innovative business practices. They're receiving the funding that they need in order to expand by issuing stock. This had never been done before. Stock is just basically you're selling a small piece of your company to individuals who will then give you money that will allow you to have funds to expand, right? Um, so we start to see the nature of business change in relation to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. But more importantly, when you were a producer of a good, when you were kind of limited in the market that you could sell to, if you were a producer in Chicago, for instance, right? Um, most people in that location knew who you were, knew the good you produced, and you could get by on your reputation. Well, how do you do that once you're marketing your goods on a national scale? You cannot just send your goods across the country. You can't count on your reputation to make it over there with your goods. You want people to know that your product can be trusted. And so, how do you do that? Well, what ends up happening is we see the development of the idea of a brand. That there's a specific brand name that you use, and people associate the product that you produce with that brand, and you can develop a national reputation in that way. Um, and it serves as a substitute for that personal reputation that you would have had as a business owner operating in a specific location during that time. But also, it thoroughly changes the nature of work that we have. There's these remarkable changes that happen to work habits, the physical environment that work is done in, the pace of labor, right? Because as I mentioned before, most people in the early 1800s were subsistence farmers. You grew food for yourself. So your work habits were you woke up in the morning, you would do however much work you needed to, but you're working at home for the most part, right? So this is the physical environment that it's happening in. The pace of the labor is you work until you need to take a break, and then you take a break, but you're your own boss. You're dictating this. This was true also of skilled artisans like shoemakers and things like this, and I'll get into that in the next lecture. But as factories become the norm, right? Work habits change because now there's a set time that you have to show up. The physical environment changes because now there's a factory, there's an actual designated place that you go to every morning where your work is done. And the pace of labor because ultimately, as business owners, you want to know if you're paying your employees, you want to know that they're doing an adequate job. And so you're expected to produce a certain amount of goods. So all of these things change as a result of the Industrial Revolution.